Hey there, I'm Katja Savia, an independent artist from Finland. This is an extra video for the Halloween. I asked you to share your paranormal, supernatural stories with me. I'm going to read them and react to them. But first, before we get into the stories, I want to share why I wanted you to share your supernatural stories with me. About my past, I grew up in a very religious household and home. It was strict, religious, you could almost call it as a cult. The religion strongly believed in positive spirituality, but also in negative spirituality. They didn't believe that ghosts were real, but instead they believed that demons exist. So imagine every horror movie about demons, they were all real. And you can probably imagine how I grew up as a kid believing that demons exist. I was constantly afraid. I remember I probably didn't sleep a lot while I was a kid because I used to wake up during the night all panicky, sweaty, and just thinking in panic mode that demons are going to find me and eventually kill me. As I grew up and older, I realized what kind of bogus religion and cult it was, and I decided to leave that religion and find my own path. It has been a difficult process to brainwash yourself from all these beliefs, and when you thought that you know who you are as a person, but then you kind of like realize that you're a completely different person, it's a huge process that can take a whole lifetime. I wanted you to share your stories with me because I want to broaden my view on supernatural and paranormal. This autumn I've been diving deeper into this concept of supernatural, ghosts, ghost stories, demons, demonology, Satanism, satanistic rituals, and just see how I feel about them. How do they affect me, and are they real? So let's dive deep into your story and let's broaden our perspective on these things. First story is submitted by King Dimitris. King Dimitris writes, "Here is my real horror story. My name is Dimitris and I am 43 years old, born in 1980. So, in 1987, if I remember correctly, I was sleeping with my brother in our room. After a deep sleep, I woke up around 3-4 a.m. I guess. I opened my eyes and it was all dark, so I continued my sleep without fear. After a while though, I started hearing footsteps from the living room and they were getting closer and closer. They stopped inside the room where I was sleeping and I strongly felt someone's presence. I opened my eyes and I saw a human black shadow that stood out clearly in the darkness, sitting on a chair in front of the door of the room looking at me. I closed my eyes, but I was overcome with intense fear and I couldn't calm down. After a while, I stood up on the bed and started crying. I saw the shadow slowly getting up from the chair and coming towards me, raising its arms as if it wanted to grab me. It arrived right in front of me, and at that moment my aunt turned on the light. My mother was working in hospital at night sometimes. And the shadow and the chair disappeared. I continued my sleep normally after calming down. But the next night, when I woke up again after a deep sleep, I think again around 3-4 in the morning, I saw again that same human shadow. It was a man's form, distinguishable even more clearly in the darkness, and standing upright in front of my brother's bed, looking at him. I did nothing and just continued to sleep. I may have been 7 years old at that time. Some may doubt that I was young and it may have been something else, for example, dreaming, but it was real and happened while I was awake. Years later, I happened to mention it to an acquaintance of mine who dealt with ghosts, spirits, etc. And he asked me to explain everything to him because these things exist. He was quite knowledgeable, and for this fact he told me that there is a definition that I no longer remember. It is the case that in a space, room, only one sees something and no one else. It is the case that in a space, room, only one sees something and no one else. Indeed, my brother only remembers me shouting and could only make out me in the room and nothing else. Before this event, I had no problem with the dark. But since then, I have a serious issue and there is always a little nightlight when I sleep. If it's not there and everything is dark, I suddenly start to feel strange. I can't calm down and I feel very strongly that I will see something, as if there is an extra sense inside me where I can see things that others cannot. Wow, this is a great story that got me thinking. Dimitris is describing here a situation where he woke up during the night, in middle of the night, and saw a shadow figure in the room. And other people were in the same room as well, but they didn't see this shadow figure. But after a couple of incidents, Dimitris has been affected by these supernatural experiences. Now that I've been introduced myself with ghost hunters, shadow figures are many times mentioned and encountered. I've never personally encountered a shadow figure, so I don't really know what it is. How does it look? I've always thought that ghosts are something of a glowing, like a white light of something, but instead they can be shadows. Thank you, Dimitris, for sharing this story. It was fascinating. Next story is by Dark Trilarian. Throughout my entire life, and even until this day, I have suffered terrible nightmares almost every night. Whether it's a poltergeist terrorizing my home, giant tidal waves crashing over the city where I live, people chasing me through the streets trying to kill me, exploding volcanoes, storms with tornadoes miles high, insects ripping my flesh apart, aliens invading the planet, or being sucked into hidden cities beneath the earth, to name just a few, my sleep has always been disturbed by images I wish that I could forget, but never do. Still, all these pale in the comparison to one night when I was a little boy in what didn't feel like a dream, but was so real, I'm almost convinced it truly happened. I grew up in a very small house that had a big front yard. It was shielded from the street by a huge pine tree on one side and tall lilac bushes on the other, which ran the length of the property, blocking the view of the street and giving us some privacy. There was also an enormous box elder tree on the left and a beautiful chestnut tree on the right, framing the yard and giving me a nice place to run and play in safety. One night, when I was about 4 years old, I found myself awake at what must have been somewhere between midnight and 3 o'clock in the morning. Everyone else in the house was asleep and things felt unusually still. Normally, I would try to go back to sleep, but for some reason I felt compelled to creep out of the bed and go into the living room, which was just adjacent to my bedroom. As I tiptoed out into the absolute silence, it was almost as if a force of nature drew me to look out the window and into the shadows. I climbed onto the couch and pulled apart the curtains. When I peered into the inky blackness, there standing in the middle of the yard, still as a statue, was someone staring directly back at me. It didn't look like a person, not like someone who had randomly disturbed the peaceful sanctuary of my neighborhood, but like someone out of a story. His clothes were exceptionally fine, with black velvet pants, a ruffled silk white shirt, a cape of a crimson and ebony, slicked back black hair, skin that was pale but a bluish tint, and huge white eyes looking straight into my very soul. I know that its appearance seems cliché, as if conjured from a bad movie poster, but just the same, he was there, completely foreign to any of my young experiences. I had never seen anyone like him before, and yet in the darkness I knew he was there for me. And I was terrified beyond anything I had ever experienced before. As strong a desire as I had to keep looking at him, and like it was absolute something I must do, I was so terrified that I began to shake and duck down onto the couch, hoping against hope that even though I knew it wasn't true, I prayed he had not seen me. I stayed that way for what felt like hours, wishing that it was all just a bad dream and that whoever was there in my yard would simply go away. It took all of my courage then to carefully pull myself up and as stealthily as I could peek between the curtains, anxious to see my placid yard empty of this monster of the night. I was wrong. Not only had this strange character not left, but he hadn't flinched a muscle. He was now half the distance to my house that he was when I first saw him. Once again, his eyes locked with mine, and I felt absolute panic taking over my body and mind. I knew the front door was locked, but was the back door? In our safe and peaceful community, had my parents remembered to secure the only other way into the house? Even if they had, would a simple door stop who could seemingly transport himself at a whim and who seemed to know exactly where I was despite my great care? At this point, all I could do was fall back onto the floor and crawl under the couch. I don't know why I didn't try to wake my parents. Perhaps I was too scared that this enigmatic figure would hurt them and my siblings, leaving me as his final victim before the ghastly and inevitable end. All I knew was that in my heart, if I stayed under the couch, sobbing from the dread and horror, maybe, just maybe, he would forget my family, forget me, and find someone else to menace. I stayed as quiet as I could for the remainder of the night, listening for any sound and feeling for any movement, and finally, when the reassuring sound of the morning birds came and the earliest rays of the sun beamed through the window, did I finally feel safe. It was only then that I crawled out from under that old dusty couch and slipped quietly back into my bed, pondering the events of the night. It has been years since that frightening event, and I yet still remember it with incredible clarity, despite the fact that I remember little of my childhood. While I have had more harrowing experiences since, when I wasn't sure if I could live through them, none have filled me with more dread than that intruder who stared hungrily into my soul in the middle of the night. I hope that I never have another encounter like that again for as long as I live. Thank you for sharing this story. This got me thinking. In this story, a person was waking up during the night and had this feeling to step out from the bed and going to the living room and the kitchen and peeking through the window. While they were looking out of the window, they saw a figure. What resonated with me in this story was stayed there as quiet as they could the remainder of the night, listening any sounds, feeling or any movement. I remember I used to be so scared in my childhood as well that you felt this presence in the room. If you make any kind of sound, if you make any kind of movement, they're going to figure out that you're there and possibly hurt you and your family. But I can imagine this being so scary as for a kid, seeing someone, an intruder, on your yard, middle of the night when no one else is awake. That is scary. Thank you for sharing this story. Then the final story is from Bigger Guy. Quick note from Brian. I heard this story originally from my mother. She was a very shrewd woman and not prone to listen to idle gossip. I don't say that I know the story is 100% true, but I do know that my mother believed it, and that's not something I take lightly. Short as I could manage version. A man named Jack Miller died suddenly, and his older brother Keith was the only one available to come guard Jack's house. Jack had lived alone in a house just outside a small isolated town high in the Sierra foothills of California. Jack had been rich, but nobody liked him. He was greedy and selfish, and when he died young, he had no heirs and no friends. But his older brother and even his mother were still alive. Keith was the exact opposite of Jack in many ways. Generous and kind and well-liked. And when he got a call from the local sheriff explaining the situation and that no deputies could be spared to guard the house all night long, Keith had reluctantly agreed to watch his brother's house. They weren't particularly close, but Keith had gotten along with his brother better than most people probably, in part because Keith had never been afraid of Jack. Keith had never been afraid of much of anything. Jack had been big and strong and a bully, but Keith had been even bigger and stronger, and he had just laughed good-naturedly whenever Jack tried to intimidate him. Long story short, Keith drove out to his brother's place, arriving around sunset and apparently just in time. Some teenagers were parked in the driveway and they took off quick when Keith approached them. Keith did his best to make sure it was obvious that someone was watching the house in case anyone else dropped by to steal Jack's stuff. And then he settled in, planning to stay awake as much as he could all night and to take naps when he couldn't stay awake any longer. He planned to sleep in the living room, both because he couldn't quite bring himself to sleep in the bedroom where his brother had died a few hours earlier, and because it would make it easier to keep an eye on the front door. Thankfully, Keith managed to find some camping supplies out in his brother's garage, grabbed a sleeping bag and a bedroll, and made himself comfortable on the living room couch. He smiled bemusedly at the name labels Jack had been sewn into everything, even though he lived alone and never loaned anything to anybody. Jack had been like that even as a child, never one to share his toys. Early in the next morning, so I'm told, just after dawn, the mother got a call from Keith. The conversation, as I understand it, went something like this. "Mom, it's Keith. I'm sorry, Mom, but I'm not going back into Jack's house. I don't care if people steal everything he ever owned. I don't care if we burn the place to the ground with everything inside it. In fact, I think maybe we should do just that." I tried to nap for just a little bit early this morning. Sometime around 2 a.m., I finally fall asleep. but something kept waking me up. I checked outside. I thought maybe some noise had woken me up, but I didn't see or hear anybody. Eventually, I got back to sleep, but it happened again. Something woke me up. And this time I was convinced that somebody was in the room with me. I couldn't see anything, but I just had that feeling like someone was watching me. I got up and shone a flashlight around, and there was nothing, nobody. So I went back and crawled into the sleeping bag a third time, but before I lay down, I made sure every light in that room was on. I told myself I was doing it to make sure that anybody outside could tell the house was being guarded. Then I just lay there quietly, not sleeping, waiting to find out if I could hear anything. I never did hear anything or see anything, but I felt it. With the room fully lit, so I could see every inch of it, I couldn't see anybody. I couldn't hear anybody, but I could feel. With me staring straight through the empty air, I could feel hands grabbing at me. They were pulling on Jack's sleeping bag, and I knew it was him, trying to get me out and trying to take back his damn sleeping bag for himself. This was kind of hilarious story, entertaining story in my opinion. Thank you for sharing this story. This story is about very greedy ghost. A person who was greedy in their past life and also greedy when they became a ghost. This story got me thinking about energy. One explanation to ghosts would be energy. Like if we have strong emotions while we live, sadness, happiness, jealousy, vengeance, all these strong emotions, they usually manifest themselves into actions and then probably into actual things, physical things. These strong emotions, what if they keep on existing without us, without our bodies, without our minds? For example, we tend to see these ghost figures in the same hallways, in the same windows, opening the same doors. So what if it's just the energy that was left behind? That's one interesting explanation that I've come across with ghosts, and this last story reminded me of that energy. What if the energy just keeps on existing, creating a poltergeist or something else? Thank you, Dimitris, Michael, and Brian. Thank you for sharing your stories. All these stories helped me to broaden my perspective on supernatural. I want to give a huge thank you for these people sharing their stories. I want to wish you happy Halloween, and we see each other next time on another episode. Bye.